Okay. Again, these slides are posted in the learning resources in the classroom if you want to refer to them. But I want to talk just for a minute, kind of defining what we mean when we say groups or groups. What is a group? And you probably guessed that the most basic definition is two or more individuals come into personal and meaningful contact on a continuous basis. Okay. In generally, when we're talking about group techniques, we're talking about a group size of anywhere from 6 to 9 individuals. But I do want to point out that things like couples therapy is also considered a form of group treatment, as you do many of the same facilitation things with with a with a married couple as you would in the normal group setting. I shouldn't say normal, in other more familiar group settings. So we kind of want to point that out. I also want to kind of point out the difference between what we mean by groups and teams, because they're not the same. Okay. Teams can be considered a subset of groups. Teams have more structure. And while we do have group treatment goals, teams have very specific goals. So, and I just kind of bring this up to kind of tell the difference when we talk about the group process. Even when we're dealing with manualized groups, these are groups that have been tested, and you have to use kind of this manual to go through each of the sections or each of the modules for the group. The goal of the group is to have the group guide the process, even in highly structured groups. Okay. When we're talking about teams, each member has a very specific place, specific component. When we're talking about groups, each member has an equal status. Each member doesn't have their own unique little, one is the note taker, the other is the researcher, the other is the talker. That's a team. When we talk about groups, everyone is of equal status and equal importance. Okay. Hold on just a second.
Mr. Curtis, if you're talking, I can't hear you.
All right, good to meet you. Good to meet you. Come on in. So we're talking about groups. Sorry, everyone, we have a on-campus student here today. Um, so we were talking about groups. Let me, whoops, and kind of defining what a group is. And we're basically saying the most basic definition is just two or more individuals that come together. And I mention this because normally when we talk about group techniques and stuff, is we're usually talking about 6 to 9 people together for treatment or something. But even things like couples therapy is considered a form of group treatment because you use the same facilitation skills that you use with a group as you would with a couple. So, yeah. So kind of a sounds no duh, but it is what it is. So I want to talk for just a minute about group size and group tasks. When we're talking about a treatment group, okay, we're usually talking about a group of about 6 to 9 is the ultimate number. When you get less than 6, you tend to get less conversation between group members. You get less cohesion. When you get above about 9, you start to kind of lose the ability for everyone to talk and interact with each other. So when we look at group size, we want to kind of keep it between 6 to 9. And I will tell you, one time I was doing a domestic violence psychosocial educational group for survivors, and we got up to 18 group members, and it was ridiculous. It became a class instead of a group. And that's what we mean why we want to manage the size of the group. What we ended up doing with that is dividing it into 2 separate groups. Um, and so kind of keep that in mind as you're looking at your group and your group structure. Okay. The group tasks impact how groups interact. So task interdependence shows how work of one member impacts another. Probably next week, we're going to talk about identity, and group identity becomes very important in the treatment process. But we'll talk about the good side of that, but we also need to talk about the dark side, which we'll get to. But when you have the whole purpose behind a good group treatment is a lot of individuals who are suffering from addiction, who are suffering from a mental illness or some type of trauma, often feel like they're alone. They feel like they're the only ones with that problem, or that they're unique to their situation. And what a group allows us to do is it allows people to see, one, I'm not alone. Two, there's other people who have gone through what I went through. And three, these are people I can connect with. I can be a part of and understand the dynamics that I've gone through. And then, of course, your job as a facilitator is to make sure that the group doesn't become what's called an enabling group. Okay. This is often when each of the group members start to enable each other's symptoms. Okay. So, for example, in addiction groups, you will often run into situations where uh, group members will start to fantasize about use, and they'll start telling about the good times of using, and remembering and reminiscing about times um, uh, past when they've been high, their war stories. Yeah. And again, coming from research, most of the time when that is allowed, those group members, guess what they did after group? They went and relapsed. Yeah. Yeah, and so you want to be careful of that enabling behavior that can occur in a group, and you want to keep it focused on healing, not on enabling behaviors. So something to kind of keep in mind. Okay. Landon, yes, you can. I apologize. I didn't use a classroom today because I haven't had anyone on campus so far, but we do have one here. It's Thursday. Ryan's here, and on Thursday we'll be in classroom 123 in the I think it's the Arts and Science building. I forget the ton off the name for this building, but it's right by the art studio, just down the hall from there. Hope to see you. All right. You had a question about on campus. Um, so one other common issue with groups is what's known as social loafing. And if you've ever done a class group project where you're all divided into groups and you do a group project, you probably know this well. Is usually there's if you're in a group of 5, there's like 2 or 3 that do all the work, and the others just kind of float. And on the day it's submitted, they go, oh, what did you need me to do? If you've ever experienced that in a group project, that's an example of social loafing. Where you find it quite a bit in the group setting is especially in situations where the group member is not there voluntarily. Either they're court ordered or they have to do it for probation purposes or for employment purposes. And they kind of want to just kind of skirt under the radar. Okay. Some ways to reduce social loafing, even in those tougher, more ordered individuals who are ordered to treatment, is making sure that you make individual contributions identifiable. Okay, usually, a lot of groups start with a thinking check-in of some type where you have them say something, a success they had over the last week, or some issues they've had over the last week, and you go through each group member. And it's important as the facilitator to recognize each individual's valued input when that happens. Okay. And emphasizing the valuable individual contributions. Okay. And again, we're coming down to keep your group size at an appropriate level. Okay. Again, the golden area is about 6 to 9 participants. I would worry if, you might be able to push it to 12, but beyond that, you're going to definitely have these kinds of issues occur. All right. Just talk about some interdependence types. So this is kind of what we're trying to create in a lot of ways. We have what's called pooled task interdependence, as members make separate independent contributions to the group. And group performance is the sum of the members' contributions. So this is kind of that check, when you do a check-in at the beginning of a group and each person makes a contribution. But it's also when you raise a question of some type and you ask each group member to provide what they think the answer to that question is. Okay. Sequential task is members perform tasks in a sequential order. I'm trying to think. So this may be a task where you do some type of role playing. Maybe role play a critical situation or a difficult situation, and you have one group member do part of it and the other group members do the other part of it. The hard part about this is it encourages communication and problem solving, but individual contribution isn't really what you're really looking for. You're looking for that sequential. Did they get from point A, the conflict, to point C, the resolution as a group? And then reciprocal task interdependence is work performed by members independent on work by others. And this one is often when you use group members to provide feedback to other group members. So this is when, for example, Johnny says that he relapsed last week. We'll take an addiction example, and he describes the situation and whatnot. And you ask the other group members, in their experience, how would have they maybe handled that situation? What could you provide him? What can you provide him with feedback on what occurred? Okay. Now, this is where you do have to be very careful. Okay, and we're going to talk about different group members and whatnot, but it is important to remember that when you're asking for group member feedback, that what worked for one group member not necessarily is going to work for another group member, because we're all individuals. We all, even when we're going through the same addiction, the same trauma, we all experience it a little bit different. So you want to encourage advice giving in a sense, but you don't want to have them give directly, this is what you should do next time, because that often leads to horrible outcomes, especially if you're doing groups with people who have experienced some type of trauma. Because one trauma response for another person can be totally different for another person. So kind of keep that in mind when you're asking group members to provide advice. Make sure that you as a facilitator facilitate it as these are options. It's not what one should do. Okay. Suggestions. Yeah. Yeah.
Statements like that also help, like the individual can be like, in my experience, what I have done is, go, I've done this or that, and then you kind of, not make it about you, but you're providing that example of how, the situation was handled, and you give a rough outlook on that, and then that way they're not thinking, the individual is thinking that this is what you got to do. What you should do is, and I've been to AA meetings where people are like, well, what a person's got to do is,
Yeah.
having those kind of statements, and what a guy should do is do this, do that, but it's just suggestive because you're not putting a real label on it. So I mean that's been my
Excellent.
experience.
No, excellent. That's an excellent example. I hope everyone heard what was stated about, not putting something on someone, but statements like, well, in that situation, I would, instead of saying you should. Those kind of statements. Excellent. Good. Yeah. Good point. All right. So I want to talk about the natural stages of groups here for a minute. There's called forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. And we'll go through each of these. And groups often move, and even with structured group, manualized groups, groups tend to move through these stages. And but it's important to note that you can regress in a stage, or you can jump ahead a stage. So it's not completely linear, but we're going to present it in a linear way to kind of show how they move. Okay. And I will say the faster that groups can move through this process, the better. Okay. So again, we're going to look at degree of maturity of the group. Okay, on one axis here, and we're going to look at time on this axis, start to end, low to high. When we're referring to maturity, we're talking about performance of group members participation, group members' willingness to want to change and make a difference in their life. Okay. So when we're looking at the forming component, we're looking at the getting to know each other moment. And when you know that you're going from what's called forming to storming, is that all group members have had the chance to introduce themselves, get to know each other, and they start to develop that group identity that we're all here for a common reason and for a common purpose. Okay. After the forming stage, and you'll note this when people, instead of coming to group, they kind of walk in and kind of keep to themselves, but instead they walk into the group and they're shaking each other's hands and saying hello to everyone. This is when you're going to go into the next phase of group development, which is the storming phase. The storming phase is where you're really getting into the difficulties of, for example, addiction and trauma, and integrating group members' experiences with whatever treatment model you're going to be using to challenge some of the addictive thoughts, for example, or challenge some of the victimization that occurs with a lot of trauma. And you're going to start having them do the hard work of really understanding their addiction or the trauma that they've experienced. Okay. And then eventually, after that, we're going to get into what's called the norming phase, where that the trauma or the addiction is part of who we are. It's a component of who we are, but it's not everything. It's just a part of us. And once we're to this phase, this is where, if you want to think about this, in the norming phase in addiction group is when that one person in the group says, I'm not an addict, I'm just here because the court's ordered me, or something like that. And but what you're getting into the norming phase when that person comes and says, you know what, I am an addict, I do have this issue. Or the person who has gone through trauma goes, I have difficulties with what happened to me, and it is hard. Okay. And that's when you're getting to that norming phase, because everyone's starting to accept their unique condition and their unique place. But they also are starting to understand that that's only a component of who they are. It's not the complete person. Okay. And this is when you can get into performing. So, in a lot of treatment modalities, this is where you start introducing relapse prevention skills, for example. This is where you start giving homework for each of the group members. This is where, in a lot of treatments, there's one for PTSD where they have them write a letter to whoever had traumatized them in some way. Not that they'll ever send the letter, that they have them write letters to kind of go start processing that trauma and letting it out. Okay. And so you're starting to kind of do the work of the group. Okay. Now, as lovely as it would be, we'd love for everyone to continue to perform, but sometimes a group will start to adjourn even before the complete treatment is complete. And this is where it kind of gets difficult is at some point, group members are going to kind of like, oh, I don't want to be here anymore. They're going to kind of start not communicating as much. They're going to start to disengage from the group. Now, this is in a way a positive thing, okay? Because this means that they're getting to the point where they can handle either their addiction or they can handle their trauma, and they're okay. That the group is now just becoming a tertiary part of their healing journey, okay? So in a lot of ways, this is a healthy component. The thing that you will want to look for when you start to see people starting to slack off in groups, as you would say, or stop performing, is do they go back to being argumentative like they were maybe in the storming phase, where they're coming in and they're just arguing with everyone? Or are they feeling like they have to reconnect with everyone in the forming stage? Okay. If that starts to occur during the slowing of performance, that usually means the individual has either, for example, relapsed, or in a lot of addiction things, they regained addictive enabling relationships. In the trauma arena, when we're talking about domestic violence, the person may have gone back to their abuser, or they may be looking at another relationship that can be potentially abusive. So you want to be careful, because while for the most part, when we're going through a journeying phase and you kind of start seeing individuals not engaging, usually that's a good sign. But if they start to go back to arguing and feeling like they're disconnected from the group, if they start to feel like they have to regain a sense of normality in the group, that's a warning sign that you have a potential relapse of some type. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah. So in my experience, so I've seen seen people in groups when they go to engage, they feel like they told too much, or they express too much, or maybe they think that maybe I shouldn't have said that. So when they do that, they feel emotionally resentful. They feel like everybody in the group might have that resentment toward them based on what they might have said. And that's what's kind of some issues with people when they regress back to how they feel before. They're really disconnected. They disconnect themselves. They're real quiet. They're not engaged anymore. And that could also be a relapse of emotion. So then they go back into the shell, as it were, and kind of start putting up the walls again, because they feel like they're being judged again. Because one of the things I've seen that people really have a hard time with is acceptance of other people, or needing that acceptance from other people, or feeling like they don't have it, or, like, oh, well, I shouldn't have said that. This person's gonna judge me based on, what I said in that group, or,
Mhm.
and, that's just been, one thing too, but, I've seen people go into a mental, relapse, and, having that, the stigma of, well, everybody's gonna judge me because based on, what I said, and they don't know what I'm going through, and
Mhm.
when in fact, I mean, most people do, because they've, whether or not it's in Arizona or Montana or New York, everybody has the same kind of trauma, just they deal with it differently, or happen to them in a different area or in a different way, but underlying thing is it's still trauma.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And there's something important that you just said about building walls. And we'll talk about this when we get into facilitation skills, because again, that's going to be one of those warning signs. If you remember when we talked about those defense mechanisms in the beginning of class, those are kind of some of the warning signs that we need to look for. And when people start to become guard stated, that's when you as a facilitator have to take over and kind of readjust the way the group is being facilitated or being processed. And so I'm going to put that on our facilitators later on in the class. So, all right. So let's take a closer look at each of these stages. So we'll start with the forming. This is when a group, again, group is brought together. There's an orientation of some kind. This is usually when, for example, as a group facilitator, you provide the disclosure of the group, the informed consent. You provide the rules of the group. And I will tell you, this is important to kind of keep in your toolbox. We usually have standardized rules, with the confidentiality, respect for each other, all of those types of things. But it is always important to, at the end of presenting that, ask group members if they want any additional rules for that group. Okay. And I'll tell you, the main reason of doing that is you want the group to be there. You want them to take ownership of it. But the other interesting thing is I've seen groups come up with some of the funniest rules. One group agreed no gum chewing or something like that. But and they sometimes come up with some of the most interesting rules that seem kind of non-relevant, but to that group they are relevant because of something they decided on and they agreed upon. And so it's important to allow that ownership. And even if something sounds quote unquote silly to you as a facilitator, it needs to go down on the list if everyone agreed on it. And it's important. Yes. Yeah. Okay. This is also when I don't want to use this term, but it does happen. This is when you become aware of friendships that start to develop. And we are going to talk about being careful with friendships here when we look at our facilitation skills, because one of the dangers of the friendship development is you can start to develop cliques within a group where only certain individuals will talk with certain other individuals. And then a lot of times those cliques will try to dominate your group. Okay. The other thing you need to be very careful of with friendships, even as a professional facilitator or therapist, is human attractiveness. And we'll talk a lot more about this later. It's interesting that even in research where the facilitators say that they have no preference for group members, that they're objective with all of their group members, when we record them, they still tend to provide the more attractive group members with more attention, more positive feedback, and those types of things. And we see that from group members. They tend to focus on those more attractive members of the group. They tend to be more sympathetic and empathetic towards them. And so be careful of these friendships, because our job as a facilitator should be having that awareness that occurs even on a very unconscious level, and that we need to model that every group member, regardless of their situation, their attractiveness, their mental state, their mental well-being, every group needs to have a say. They need to all have time to talk and process. Okay. So be careful of friendships, because friendships in the group setting is everyone should be friends with everyone. Okay. But kind of keep this in mind as a facilitator, especially in the development of a group in this very forming phase. Amount of information and commitment of acceptance of this as organizational goals, but basically when we're talking organizational goals, it's those confidentiality rules, those, we don't talk about any specific person outside the group, those kinds of things, your obligation to the organization or to whoever, for whatever reason you're there for that group. And this is where you also need to use skills to reduce things like anxiety and concerns about individual performance of each group member. Okay. And this is where, again, going back to that attending and listening part that we started with last week becomes really important. Providing that attentiveness and providing that I'm here to listen and not criticize and be open to anything that any of your group members say is important, and modeling that for your group members. Does that make sense? And then the last part that you want to do, you want to see in the forming phase, the main skill you want to develop is what's called group efficacy. And this is the belief in the group's ability to overcome or become, if it's the goal is sobriety, for example, that as a group we can do this. Okay. Now that might not mean that each individual may be fully believing that they as an individual have that capability yet. But at the group level, at least on the belief that as long as I stay in this group, I can eventually get to the point where I believe that I have the efficacy towards sobriety, or that I can manage my trauma triggers and my trauma symptoms. Okay. And so it's may not be on the individual level, but what you want to look for is on the group level, the belief in the group in this forming phase, at least. All right, then we're going to go into, once we see this belief in the group, then of course we're going to have conflict. And this is why the next stage is called the storming conflict stage. Okay. This is where you're going to see some competitive, you can see some competitive or strained behaviors emerge over conflicts of, for example, who I am as a group member, my role, my place, what the objectives are for me. This is where you're going to start to see the emergence of dominant group members, those ones that tend to take over the group a lot of times, and try to kind of usurp a lot of the time and the situation. Okay. Spreading conflict can lead to frustration and anger. And this is why we will spend some very specific time on things like conflict resolution as a group facilitator, because in this phase is where you're going to see most of the conflict that occurs between group members. So in that beginning phase, we're getting to know each other. And then in the storming conflict stage, we're starting to see, one, competition among group members, and two, we're starting to see differences of opinions, differences of ideas. And this is good, because this is going to eventually lead to the development of norming and saying, okay, I have this experience, but we're still in that same boat, kind of like what you were talking about. We both still have this. We may have different experiences, but we're still in that same boat. Okay. Um, I do want to spend a minute on the emergence of dominant members. This is going to be a natural process of any group. There's always a group where there's going to be the leaders and the followers and those types of things. But this is where you, as the group facilitator, need to make sure that you're kind of allowing that dominant person to speak, but allowing other group members to have equal time. Okay. And I have seen this to where even what we call master therapists, these are people who practice for 30, 40 years, is that there are groups where they will simply bring in a timer for each group member because they have one or two or maybe three individuals that want to take up all the time. So they have to put something as literal as a timer. Here's your 5 minutes. And when the bell goes off, or in a lot of places, they'll use like a stick. You know, you have the stick for 5 minutes and you pass the stick on to the next person, those kinds of things. Sometimes you will need to go to that kind of extreme. Okay. But we will learn some techniques that hopefully minimize that, so you don't necessarily have to, because we want to try to make sure all group members are heard without having to put a drastic thing like a timer for everyone. So we'll kind of go over that as we go. The other thing that you do need to be careful of, and this is why it's important to make sure you review each of your clients' records. Okay. I'll bring up the example of domestic violence offender groups. It is important to make sure that you weed out, for example, individuals who have psychopathic tendencies. Okay. A psychopath is someone who has no emotions towards other people. That part of their brain is that track towards emotion just doesn't exist. And so they see other people as things to consume, as to use for their own gratification or hedonistic needs. Okay. And research after research after research has shown that if you have a psychopath in your group, one, treatment for these individuals does nothing. We have not found an effective treatment for psychopathology, but in a group setting, you actually make all of the other group members worse. So for example, in the domestic violence offender groups, the psychopath is so able to get the other group members to think what they did was right and effective. And it actually increases the chance that you're going to end up having more offending behaviors. So within your area of practice, you want to be aware of your client's past. You want to look at their psychosocial histories from their intake person. You'll want to really know who they are, because if you start to see dominant tendencies, psychopathic tendencies, you'll want to be very careful about having that person in your group. I remember I co-facilitated a domestic violence offender group once, and one of the group members was he was a psychopath. He was a chronic offender. He had no remorse for anything. And what he was able to do is make the facilitators, including myself, react emotionally how he wanted us to react. And every time we would react a certain way, he says, haha, I own you. I have you. You're mine. And that empowered all of the other group members to say, well, what those facilitators are saying is just crap. Let's listen to this guy. So you want to be careful of those dynamics in a group. And sometimes it may mean not taking that person out of the group and saying, this just is not the setting for them. And so kind of watch for that, and watch for that dominating behaviors where group members are actually starting to compete for your emotions as a facilitator and trying to get reactions out of you or reactions out of other group members. Those are all huge warning signs that that person may not be either ready for a group or they may not be appropriate for that group. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah. So, kind of along with what you're saying is that with some of those people, I've seen people have and I like to call it charismatic manipulation. You know, because they use their their tone of voice or how they word things, or maybe someone they might be pretty intelligent, but they utilize that in a negative behavior and manipulate people to kind of play follow the leader to people that are maybe in a less what do you call a more a state where they're easy to follow rather than lead, and they're at the time they're not they're just looking for something to follow along with, and they very fragile, and they're in that stage where they're still hurt, but they're all that trauma or whatever they're going through, they're still in that mode of being dependent on another person, or getting told what to do, or what have you. And that's what I've seen people have that charisma to manipulate people very well, and then some people don't even know that they're doing it, and that's just been in my experience. So.
Excellent. Yep. Great example. Great example. Okay. All right. So again, the conflict stage, what you eventually want to do is get to some type of resolution. Again, we all have different experiences, but we're in the same boat. Okay. And then we start to get into what's called the norming phase. And this is when members begin to feel positive about the group and what it's supposed to be here to do. And again, it's that we are in it together phase, is this norming phase. And this is where things like roles are set up. This is where, as a facilitator, you can start introducing homework or skill development or coping skills of some type. And this is also where members of the group start to enforce the rules, not the facilitator. Okay. In that beginning phases, through storming phase, usually it's the facilitator that has to say, hey, we all need equal amount of time to talk. We agreed we wouldn't, talk outside the group. Usually it's the facilitator that has to kind of manage those rules and norms of the group. But you're in the norming phase when the group members start to enforce their own rules and their own norms. Okay. And so that's kind of what you want to look for when you're going from that storming to norming, because now that you're out of that conflictual phase, now the work can start. Now you can really begin developing those coping skills that are necessary for trauma or relapse prevention, whatever it may be. And this is where you can really start having them do the work of the group. Okay. Now, to have this said, though, these phases, they can happen within one or two groups, but it may take 5, 6, 7 groups. One group I had, it took almost 8 sessions, 8 weeks just to get to this part. And I will tell you, each group is different. I never, just like classes, I've taught introduction to psychology every semester and every summer since 2010. And I have never taught that class the same, because there's always different dynamics. There's always different students who want to focus on something or interested in something else. And so I always say I've never taught a class the same twice or experienced the same class twice. And this is the same thing with groups, okay? But I'm also going to state this right now. This is also a good personal note for burnout, okay? Is if you start seeing your clients, if you start seeing your groups as all the same issues, day in, day out, that's a huge warning sign that you're going through burnout. And you need to really check yourself, check with your supervisors or supervisors, and really kind of check on yourself. Maybe it's time to take a vacation or something, because when you instantly know that when this person comes into your office, they're going to say this, you're going to say that, I'm going to give them this tool, that tool, and send them on their way. That's a huge warning sign that you're going through burnout and you're going to stop being really effective as a helper or as a counselor. So that's something to kind of note as we're saying about groups enforcing their own rules. They all do it slightly different based on the group dynamics. And if you start seeing your groups as all the same, all the members the same, that's when you need to check yourself. Okay. So just something to kind of keep in mind when we're looking at that. Okay. So let's break this down a little bit more. What are some behavioral norms? So we know that informal rules of behavior, so they start enforcing not necessarily the written down rules, but maybe paying attention kind of and getting people centered, are widely shared and enforced by the group, okay? Some of the things that we do want to do during this period as facilitators, because as they start to enforce these rules, they cannot tend to not be as tactful as say you were when you were doing it in the earlier phase. So you got to be careful of and look out for example, predictability of behavior. Prevent embarrassing situations and express important behaviors. Okay, so your job during this phase really is to model how to give each other that feedback of I notice you didn't finish your homework, Joe, but not calling them out and embarrassing them on that. Does that make sense? Okay. Dress, humor, attitude towards the group, what is okay and to take from the group is all important. Okay. I'm going to skip that one. You know what? I'm actually going to stop here because these need to be talked about all in sequence. So I'm going to escape our Zoom.